The video I was originally going to make today was going to be about where I would take the Transformers movies from here. The Transformers cinematic universe, is that the word we're going to use? Is really the second one. The first was the Michael Bay universe and everything that came with that, mostly the IDW comics that helped bridge the gap for the Michael Bay films, and it was really good. A lot of people think that the movies stand in a vacuum. I can see why a lot of people are confused about the film continuity if they haven't read the novels and the comics that go with it, because the films by themselves are fairly broken. But with the ancillary material, it becomes a much more cohesive story. You get to see a lot of creative ways how they fix some plot holes in the expanded universe. But Bumblebee marks the beginning of a new movie universe. It is a reboot. We've talked about this several times, but I was just going to talk about where I would go with the new movie universe, how I would set up a Transformers cinematic universe with Bumblebee as the first film. But as I was looking at the film, and as I was reflecting on where I would go with Transformers, I realized that there was just something off, and that's why I sort of postponed making this video. This video I am making 2 days before it's supposed to come out. Keep in mind I'm operating on a daily schedule right now, so it's not good for me to wait that long to make a video. But I started to look at the current environment for Transformers fiction, and I remember when the Primus Prime 22 channel, which was the name of my channel back in the old days, when it was really kicking up, there was a lot of Transformers fiction content coming out. There was the Legends manga, there was the fun publication stuff that was, the key to putting the entire multiverse together. There was the Michael Bay universe. There was the Aligned continuity was still going strong. The IDW universe was still going strong. The Combiner Wars trilogy was starting to rear its head. Regeneration 1 was coming to a close. Transformers fiction was really chugging on full steam ahead when I started up this channel and stuff. Or started off talking about Transformers stuff. And I looked at the status of Transformers fiction coming out right now as I'm working on some Transformers stuff, and I realized that the Transformers stuff, with some exceptions, just feels empty. While the older Transformers stuff was linked together through a metafiction that had all these things that come together, the current one doesn't, and that's because of the Shroud, which is an editorial event that ended the multiverse as a concept and made every Transformers continuity separate. This episode of Transformers Talks is going to use an element of deep lore as the foundation of this discussion. There are some critical things you should probably know before you go into this video, and that is that Transformers is more than just a bunch of series and comics that stand alone. They actually, or at least did actually, come together in a overarching narrative that's been going on since the 1980s comic from Marvel, and really kicked off around the time of the Transformers Universe comic, and then was kept alive through a lot of fun publication stuff. Transformers had a unified, deep lore, and then an event called the Shrouding took place, and the Shroud resulted in the multiverse falling apart. If you want to learn more about the Shroud, I made a Transformers lore video on the Shroud, go check that out. Again, I'm going to assume the audience for this video knows about the stuff I'm talking about, but just as an experiment, and I'll get into this in a later video, but Transformers fans don't seem to actually care much about the lore of Transformers, not like Star Wars fans do. Just out of curiosity, I want people in the comments to answer yes or no. Did you know about the deeper Transformers lore, and I'm talking about how all the universes fit together and work together and in crossover at different points? Did you know about the meta lore of the Transformers multiverse before you found my videos? That's the question, because I think a lot of Transformer fans don't, and I think a lot of Transformer fans like to ignore it just because it requires them to think a little bit, even though it's not complicated whatsoever. People like to say it's complicated. It's not by any stretch of the word complicated. It's not like Star Wars or comic continuity. It's fairly tame for a science fiction multiverse super universe thing. I predict that most of the comments will say no, they did not before they came across my channel. Because I still get comments every day about people just shocked at like Sideways' history and are surprised about how he jumped from universe to universe. The Transformers multiverse was a very present meta story in the background of the facade of having Transformers divided into different comic and show continuities. And the Shroud ended that. Alright, that covers up the recap for those who don't know what I'm talking about. But the main basis of the Shroud happening had to deal with multiversal singularities. I'm going to assume you know what a multiversal singularity is. If you don't, there's a Transformers lore video for that. Multiversal singularities was sort of the founding concept for the wider Transformers story. The meta, I'm going to call, since there's not really a real word for the overarching plot of Transformers besides the metafiction, I'm just going to say metafiction. But multiversal singularities form the basis of the metafiction. And the problem with multiversal singularities is that they include characters that are very interesting and important to talk about, like Primus and Unicron in the 13. So different shows and different comics want to talk about the Primus, Unicron, and the 13. The problem is Hasbro and Transformers, unlike Star Wars, for example, don't protect their metafiction. They don't have like an editor team, like making sure that things stayed cohesive. I think they kind of did, like back during the early 2000s, but then that disappeared around the time the movies came out, I guess. And then it just became a free-for-all with the writers. But because Hasbro and Transformers didn't really protect their metafiction that much, it meant that multiversal singularities would show up in other points in time and other series and sometimes be very different to how they're portrayed in other media, which raises some eyebrows. I think the largest example is probably the Fallen and his appearance in Revenge of the Fallen, but he's still a multiversal singularity. It's still the same Fallen you see in Dreamwave's Generation 1 comics, and the same Fallen that attacked the Japanese Generation 1 cartoon continuity. It's the same dude. Revenge of the Fallen is really like the largest offender of misusing multiversal singularities, but I digress. So there were years that went by of fun publications and other fiction trying to like smooth over the multiversal singularity stuff, add more elements to help you understand how this all fits together, like how they experience time differently. People might bring up the aligned continuity as being an offender of the multiversal singularity stuff, but that was easily smoothed over when they talked about how the Union cluster was separate from the multiverse for a little bit until Rise of the Dark Spark. So Union and the aligned continuity had nothing to do with this multiversal singularity issue. Ask Vector Prime especially did a lot of work to help smooth over a lot of the stuff with the multiversal singularities, but ultimately the decision was made to end the concept of multiversal singularities, thereby ending the multiverse, or at least the multiverse as we know it, the multiverse how it worked in the metafiction. All of a sudden all these different series were now separate. They didn't just like look separate, because any casual fan of Transformers can look at the different series and say, oh, they're all separate, but a deeper lore fan will realize how they're all connected. But now the casuals have their day. Now when you look at Transformers and it looks like different continuities, well, now it actually is different unrelated continuities that have no form of connection with each other, which is, to me at least, a fan of the metafiction, makes it feel a lot more empty. Now, the Shroud was done to prevent contradictions and stuff with the multiversal singularities. Here's the problem with that. There's another way to fix continuity issues with the singularities. It's called caring about your metafiction. It's called having someone make sure Transformers doesn't contradict itself. Essentially, it's called caring about the fiction. And I just wanted to say that I think there's been a shift over time where Transformers as a brand is no longer really paying attention to its fiction and really only focusing on the toys. Now that sounds silly considering that it started off as a toy line, and toys are like the #1 source of income for Transformers, I believe. But to say that Transformers has always not valued the fiction that much isn't really true. They were really into the fiction stuff. The Japanese Generation 1 cartoon continuity, for example, was really in-depth. IDW, really in-depth. A lot of work went into the Unicron trilogy and the aligned continuity, even though in both cases you can argue that there were too many cooks in the kitchen and that things got a little bit weird in both Unicron trilogy and the aligned continuity. But especially in the early 2000s, and also when they were like trying to put together the aligned continuity, there really was a care for continuity, even again if it ended up going in the other direction by how many people they had involved and how many different ideas they had being thrown around in different visions. But they still put an effort to care about the continuity, to care about the fiction, I should say. So my solution to the multiversal singularity issue would simply to be maybe hire someone similar to that dude who works for Star Wars that protects the continuity. He does the holocron database. Get someone similar to that to make who will consume every bit of Transformers fiction and make sure that everything's all correct. Or have some sort of editorial team that isn't lazy at their job. Because ultimately, if that really was an editorial decision to do the Shroud, then that's just like the editors saying, we don't want to do our jobs anymore. Care about the fiction you create. Because back in the 80s, it was a threefold plan. Toys, comics, cartoons. And those comic and cartoons are both fiction. Toys is 1/3 of the formula, and that threefold formula obviously worked like a genius, especially when it came to Transformers and G.I. Joe. So the solution to the Shroud would be to pay more attention. I would say if I was sitting in Hasbro, or whoever was in charge of the creative direction of Transformers fiction at the time, I'd be saying, here's what we do. First of all, we stop publishing these continuity important stories in fun publications because that's weird. Some of the most important Transformers stories to understand the continuity were published in a magazine that came out every month, mailed to you by paying a subscription to the fan club. That's a weird place to stick really important plot information. Here's what I would do. I would shift that over to IDW. I would have IDW publish a monthly series that covers content similar to what the fan magazine or the Fun Publications magazine did, at least fiction-wise. The Fun Pub magazine could continue with the articles and stuff it did, and maybe some minor stories that weren't crucial to understanding the overarching continuity of the metafiction. But I would have this IDW series, maybe called Transformers Timelines, that covered the fiction stuff and made sure that you knew how the multiverse worked. Maybe even publish a guidebook that help new readers or newcomers to Transformers understand the fiction. Because there are a lot of super intense Star Wars fans out there. But especially nowadays, a lot of them didn't become that intense in the obscure lore through reading everything. They did it through reference books. A lot of the Star Wars fan base is built up from reference books that can help you consume a lot of obscure information really quickly. Transformers never really did reference books. They did Transformers The Ultimate Guide, which is a proper reference book, and it talks about the multiversal singularities in the 13. And then they have the Allspark Almanac, which also goes into the metafiction stuff. Both the only two reference books talk about the metafiction stuff. But they're only two reference books that nobody really talks about. I'll be honest, earlier this morning I was thinking of what would it take for me to get be contracted by Hasbro or someone to actually write a reference book to cover the Transformers metafiction. Maybe snazz it up by saying it's a 35th anniversary Transformers reference guide, and has all the references to the episodes and the series and the comics, but also little text boxes that cover different points, and some of these text boxes will include the information so you know more about the context of the metafiction of Transformers. That's how I would do it. What did they do? The Shroud. Let's look at what fiction has come out since the Shroud, and for simplicity's sake, let's just look at the fiction that's come out after the Shroud that isn't connected to any specific continuity that was running before the Shroud. For example, IDW's comics were running during and after the Shroud, so let's not talk about them because they're still kind of part of the pre-Shroud universe. It just things get really confusing when you talk about something that overlapped between pre-Shroud and post-Shroud, because it's like, when Unicron shows up, is he pre-Shroud Unicron or post-Shroud Unicron? You know, you don't really know. So, post-Shroud Transformers media didn't have any connection to anything pre-Shroud, but new continuities. What have we got since the Shroud? They did this so we would avoid talking about the 13 and Unicron wrong, as opposed to doing their job. So, what came out after the Shroud that really necessitated the Shroud? Really only 3 things fit the category of things that have come out after the Shroud that don't have ties to before the Shroud. Transformers Bumblebee, the Cyberverse cartoon, and the second IDW Transformers universe. Everything else are kind of like mini-series or short stuff, or tied into previous pre-Shroud stuff. For example, I believe the Star Trek crossover is post-Shroud, but who talks about the Star Trek crossover? Really, only 3 main things have come out since the Shroud. So let's break those 3 things down into, was the Shroud necessary for this? Bumblebee. Was there anywhere in Bumblebee where they talked about Unicron or Primus or the 13 or anything about the Metafiction? No. It could fit in pre-Shroud continuity entirely fine. Don't take me out of context and say that means it can fit in Michael Bay universe continuity just fine. It can't. But it can fit in the metafiction of the pre-Shroud world just fine. But, nope, had to have the Shroud. The Cyberverse cartoon. I'll be honest, I've only watched season 1 of Cyberverse so far, but something tells me that it doesn't. Cyberverse tends to get into lore concepts. I put lore in quotations. Okay, here's real Transformers lore, the metafiction. And then there's lip service Transformers lore, which is really just mentioning the 13 or Unicron, even though they don't have the histories attached to them in the actual lore. So Cyberverse is interesting that people call it a Transformers lore heavy series. It's not, especially since it's post-Shroud. It's about as far away from being lore in depth as it can possibly be. What it does lip service. It references names that no longer carry any meaning. Now just to be clear, I like Cyberverse. I know that looked like a very negative rant against Cyberverse. I like Cyberverse. You can see my review of Season 1 here. Links in the description for all the videos I reference. But Cyberverse, I haven't watched Season, 2 or 3? I've only watched Season 1. I could see it referencing the 13 at some point, but still, they managed to deal with discrepancies with the 13 while still staying true to the multiversal singularities just fine with the aligned continuity. Or, if Cyberverse wanted to be the big lore series it wants to be, it could, talk about the 13 and stuff and not contradict the metafiction. It's what people were doing before the Shroud for the most part. I think Japanese Generation 1 and the Dreamwave universe of all places, and Transformers universe, for obvious reasons, are really the most lore-heavy Transformers series. I know a lot of people will point to Cyberverse or Aligned, but those aren't really lore-heavy. Okay, so Bumblebee didn't require the Shroud. Cyberverse didn't require the Shroud. I'm sure they reference the 13 and it gets weird compared to the previous metafiction, but that doesn't necessitate the ending of what is essentially Transformers, the ending of the metafiction. So what comes next? The IDW Transformers Universe 2, the second universe. That does not need the Shroud. If anything, it would be much better if that book was set in the pre-Shroud continuity and the writer knew about Transformers lore and could incorporate that a bit more into the book. Then that would probably be a bit more interesting for those comics, but right now it's a bit boring. And that's all that really came out. Legends ended twice. The Michael Bay universe ended abruptly. The IDW Universe 1 ended abruptly. The Aligned universe is technically still kicking with Rescue Bots Academy, so Aligned's still here, I guess, wobbling around like a corpse. Even though they said they were going to do more adult-oriented Transformers series like they were with Combiner Wars and the Prime Wars trilogy, We've yet to see any of that play out with Transformers. I know they talked about doing some sort of Netflix series, but that hasn't seen any light of day stuff. And frankly, Bumblebee's been out for a while now, and still no real tangible word on a sequel, although we know it's coming. They're taking their time with it. I don't know, I guess my point is, the Shroud wasn't necessary. Hey, Radix editing this video here. I just wanted to add one more point, and that's how I'm kind of disappointed with how continuity died quietly. How the Shroud happened very low-key in the events of across a Facebook post and some very hard-to-find comics. I guess it's fitting that the Metafiction, which was already kind of obscure, went out in such an obscure way, but it just kind of cheapens it to people who are really into Transformers and really into the Metafiction and really like these continuities. I don't know, it's just a shame to see something great die so quietly without really being noticed and without any real Transformer fans complaining about it. With Star Wars, you see people talking about the death of Legends and how it was replaced by canon all the time, but I don't think Transformer fans even knew there was a Legends for Transformers and thought that we were always in this canon status quo, which really is a shame. It used to be that you saw Transformers, got interested in it, did a little bit more research, and found out that these characters have wider stories, find out that they've come into contact with these other special characters. Unicron, which, you know, was my favorite Transformer for a while, was my first Transformers figure, that besides Rescue Roy. Turns out Unicron's part of this multiversal singularity, and then all of a sudden you see how it all fits together, and you're like, wow. But now, when you look at a Transformers series, you look at the Transformers cartoons and comics and movies, you look at them, and it used to be that, you know, when you looked at them, they were more than meets the eye. But Transformers is more than meets the eye no longer. I don't know, and that just makes me sad. Thank you so much for watching. Check out the social media links in the description. Consider supporting me on Patreon. That's up now, so if you want to see this channel continue, please consider supporting me there. And subscribe if you have not yet. Have a great day, ladies and gentlemen. This month's videos were brought to you by patron Josh Adkins. Thank you very much. Check out the description for more info about how you can receive a shout out here.
Those who wagered aren't so clever, 'cause in heaven, well, the house always wins. House always wins.